We continue now our study of the book of 1 Corinthians, looking now at chapter 10 of the letter, the first inspired letter that Paul wrote to the Corinthian Christians. And for the purposes of this study, it is a study of two more problems of the 16 that Paul covers in this 1 Corinthian letter, this being problems number 8 and 9, which are really two sides of the same coin. You could even argue that this is not two different problems. We're dividing them up for our purposes of this study, but it's very obvious that they go hand in hand, these two problems. The first one being with falling from grace, and the second problem being specifically idolatry. The first problem is dealt with in the style of a history lesson, where the author reminds his audience of Hebrew ancestors of the past and the sins that they committed, that is to say, and the punishments that were levied against them by God. And then he makes application to the modern era and warns his brethren not to commit the same sins lest they have the same punishment fall on them. And then he leaves the history lesson and proceeds more to a topical discussion for the ninth problem, which concerns idolatry. And it's a revisit of some of the issues that came up in chapter 8 of this letter, which involve meat offered to idols and the eating of those meats. It's about 33 verses long, so let's just dive right into the text and notice problems 8 and 9 confronting the church at Corinth. The first one being, as we said, problems from grace, and Paul opens the chapter by setting the stage for the history lesson that is to follow, by reminding them that God helped the ancestors of the Hebrew people. Of course, the Corinthian Christians are predominantly Gentile. Nevertheless, these great figures of the past, he's using their history to make example. And so he opens with the Red Sea crossing. Notice verse 1, "Moreover, brethren, I would not have you ignorant how that all our fathers, ancestors, were under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea." How our fathers, he says in verse 1, were under the cloud and passed through the sea. Of course, this is the Red Sea crossing he's describing, and he describes it using the word in verse 2 of a baptism. And of course, baptism doesn't necessarily mean to be dunked in water, as is the case here, where in the Red Sea crossing, the whole point of it was nobody got wet, because the water was parted on either side of them. The word baptism simply means an overwhelming. It could be in water, it could be in terms of suffering, as Jesus used that word when speaking to James and John, of the baptism that he was to be baptized with, that is to say, his overwhelming suffering that would come with his passion. Well, here Paul uses the word to describe a complete submersion, a complete surrounding, complete overwhelming, in this case, by the provisions of God. You see, everywhere that the Israelites of old looked, they were being provided something by God. The point he's going to make from this is to say that they rejected that in favor of tempting God, murmuring against God, mocking God, and testing the patience of God, if you will, in various ways that he will point out, the author will, Paul, later in this chapter. But he calls it an overwhelming because if I am an Israelite crossing the Red Sea, I look down at my feet and it's dry ground where the water should be, but it's not because of God. I look to my left and right and I see a wall of water where it should be crashing on me, drowning me, but it's not because God provided it. I look above me and I see a cloud that is leading me ahead of me forward to the promised land, both of which provided by God for me. I can look behind me and see the Egyptian army desiring to retake me back to Egypt, but being held at bay by a pillar of fire, again provided by God. So in every single direction that I might look, I am seeing something provided to me by God. I have been baptized unto Moses, who is leading me with God's hand from Egypt into the great promised land. And as soon as they cross the Red Sea, they come to the wilderness, where he continues verse 3 of chapter 10. They did, the ancestors, the ancient Hebrews, all eat the same spiritual meat, manna from heaven, and did drink the same spiritual drink, and he explains this one in the next phrase, for they drink of the spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. When they left the Red Sea, they came into the wilderness and began making the trek to, eventually, their promised land, to Canaan. And along the way they were hungry. God provided. What happened when they were hungry, however, is they murmured first. Instead of asking God, their deliverer, to deliver them again, they murmur, they complain, just as they did at the edge of the Red Sea before he parted it, a point that the author will make in just a moment. But after they leave the Red Sea, they get to the wilderness and they complain, they murmur against God, yet he provides, as he did at the Red Sea. He provides again, manna from heaven. They go a little farther and now they are thirsty. Yet again God provides. Despite their bad attitude, despite the people's complaining, God again provides. In this case, it's Numbers 20, when God told Moses to speak to the rock, but Moses did not speak. He instead struck the rock, which is a completely different study, one that focuses on the type of Christ in the rock, Christ being the antitype of that figurative illustration that God had put in place, and how Moses broke that by striking the rock twice when he was supposed to only speak to the rock. But that's a different study for a different time, and that, however, does explain the reference to the rock being Christ and connecting it to Numbers 20 and Moses striking the rock twice. Nevertheless, the point that he's making overall is that God, specifically in the form of Christ, if you will, provided for the people bread, and water from the rock. But with many of them, God was not well pleased. Why not? They were overthrown in the wilderness. Why? This is, of course, referring to God ultimately punishing them, finally punishing them after numerous smaller punishments by saying that they would not enter the promised land. They would wander aimlessly until that entire generation died. But he describes their being overthrown, and it happened constantly in the wilderness. They would be punished. For an example, verse 6, he says, "These are our examples," those sins and punishments for us are examples, that to the intent, to this end, that we should not lust after evil things. It's the first one of a list of at least 5 sins and punishments that he mentions in this text. The first one is lusting after evil things, as they also lusted. When did they do that? Well, probably they did it numerous times, but I think the reference is to the Red Sea before it was parted, before the crossing, when they had left Egypt and came to the Red Sea, and it was their first real obstacle, their first challenge to their faith and trust in God. After he had already gotten them out of Egypt via the 10 plagues, via the Passover, they come to the Red Sea and immediately they assume they're going to die. Immediately they're ready to reject God and go back to Egypt. They even say to Moses, "Would to God it would have been better that we live in Egypt as slaves than die with God here in the wilderness." Well, you can make a dozen applications to that poor phrase and pitiful example of faith on the part of the Israelites. So in their lusting after evil things, in their desiring the various, in hindsight, rose-colored glasses, pleasure that they had in Egypt, they were lusting after that past life. And so he warns his brethren here in Corinth that they should not lust after their past life, that they should let go of it and move on to the glory of God. So that's the first example. And they, of course, were punished as a result. And again, he says, verse 7, the second illustration, or the second example in this history lesson, "Neither be ye idolaters, as were some of them, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play." Of course, this, you can find numerous examples of them falling into idolatry, both in the wilderness and once they settled in Canaan. But I think the reference is to the foot of Sinai, when Moses had gone up to the mountain to speak to God and get the 10 Commandments. The people there at the bottom of the mountain had decided to, with the help of Aaron, construct a golden calf through whom they could commune and have a relationship with God, and not through God himself and the covenant he was preparing for them. And so that horrible example of idolatry, I think, is the reference that the author here is making with the famous golden calf. His point, of course, is these Gentile Christians, have left idolatry. Leave it behind, he says. Verse 8, third example, the third history lesson. "Neither let us commit fornication, as some of them committed, and fell in one day 23,000 or 23,000. Here, I think the reference is Numbers 25, when the children of Israel had relations with the Moabite people after they had been told to leave the other nations around them alone. They came in, there was intermingling, for lack of a better phrase, and they were sorely punished. If you read the Numbers account of it, Moses writes that there were 24,000 who died. But of course, there's no contradiction here. Paul says there fell in one day 23 of those 24,000. But still, the point he's making is not to describe who died when, but to say that they were punished because they committed fornication. A point, again, he's already listed in a couple of, a chapter prior to this, in talking about the harlots of the temple of Diana there in Corinth. So you see very specific application that he's making to these famous examples of God's punishing the people. Verse 9, the second to last of these history lessons. Neither let us, my Bible says, tempt. Probably a better translation would be test, or to push the patience of Christ, as some of them also tempted and were destroyed of serpents. This, of course, being when they were frustrated, the Israelite people were, with the manna and with all the provisions that God had given them, and they complained yet again and said, our soul loathes this light bread. And after that one more time of them complaining and speaking out against God and all the things He had given them, God sent serpents to attack the people, and they were told that if they would just look at the brazen serpent that was placed on the pole by Moses, they would be saved from the serpents that God had sent as punishment. But again, the point is not the specifics. The point is the general mention of their being punished, and making application to them, these Christians, that they should not push the patience of God, that they should stay faithful, lest they be destroyed as their ancestors were, as the ancestors of old, of previous God's people. Verse 10, the final one of the listing of 5 of these history examples is murmuring. Neither murmur ye, as some of them also murmured and were destroyed of the destroyer. I think the reference here is to Korah's rebellion and the plague that swept up and killed many people who rebelled against Moses and against ultimately God. And then he uses the word murmur, which is one of those few words in the English language that sounds like the word. It's just murmur, 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 murmur. You hear it in a crowd of people, this just chatter of discontent. And that was certainly predominantly a part of the people as they wandered in the wilderness, as they made their way to the promised land. Again, hear the words, promised land, but they did not take it, they did not appreciate it. They took it for granted, all that God had provided for them. And they murmured, they rebelled, they tested God's patience, they committed fornication, though they were told not to. They turned to empty, foolish, dead idols, when the one true and living God who had ultimately and finally saved them over and over was right there, literally as close to them as their feet was to the tip of the mountain, where their camp was to the mountain of Sinai. That's how close they were to the physical presence of God on earth. But they turned to idols, and they turned to all these other things, and as such were punished. And the point that the author is making, you see in verse 11, all these things happened unto them for, not examples, my Bible says an ensample, which means a model. That if, in other words, he's saying, if we do what they did, we're going to have the same punishment they had. If we follow their example, if we follow that type, that pattern, that model, we can expect to receive the exact same punishment they received. That's the ensample. And they are written for our admonition. Moses wrote all of those circumstances down in the Pentateuch so that we could look back on them and see, if I commit this sin, I'll be punished as they were punished. So that we might have the admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come. In other words, for those people who were punished, it served as an example for the next generation, these Christians today. But if we sin and we're punished, there'll be no next generation. Because after this life, after this age, the Lord returns, this world is over. So we need to be right now, because the end of the world is all that we have left. Verse 12, which I believe is the bridge between problems 8 and 9. You can connect it with the problem of falling from grace, as all those examples were. They had favor with God, and they left it, favor with God, and they left it. The ultimate application is we Christians have grace, favor with God. We can walk away from it too, committing various sins, some of which are mentioned here. So you can connect that here where he says, wherefore let him that thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. Let him that thinks he's standing there all by himself, that he can do it on his own, he's going to fall because he needs God in his life. You want to commit idolatry? You want to have a relationship with an idol without God? You're going to fall. You want to commit fornication, have your own kind of life, not following God's example? you're going to fall. You want to test the patience of God as though you are on His level, you're going to fall. You want to murmur as though you have the right to speak out against, to speak ill against God, as though you can alone stand up to God. You think you're standing, but you're going to fall without God. So you can certainly connect it to the earlier problem, but I tend to connect it to the next problem, which is problem number 9, a problem of idolatry. And the first kind of idolatry listed, therefore, is here in verse 12. If I think I'm standing alone, if I think I'm standing, the implication is by myself. That is self-idolatry. I can do it on my own. Self-idolatry. Thus I will, like every other dumb idol, ultimately fall before God. And then he continues, verse 13, temptation, outward trial that is, there is no temptation, there is no outward trial taken you, but such as is common to man, but God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted above that which you are able, but will with the temptation also make a way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. Notice again, break it down. There is no outward trial taken you, but such as is common to man. There is no outward trial that has ever affected me that could not also have affected someone else. Doesn't mean it will affect someone else. There are those who suffer things that I will probably never suffer, but I could suffer them. No outward trial is special. No person is unique in that they're going to suffer an extra amount because they're somehow special one way or the other. Everyone who has suffered any kind of outward trial has suffered what could have been suffered by anybody. Therefore it is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be outwardly tried above that which you are able. He's not saying in the text, as some have misused, that God will just keep putting outward trial after outward trial on you because He knows you can handle it. That is the opposite way to read this text. What he's saying is, with every trial you face, recognize that you are not facing something that nobody else could face. You are not facing something that you can't bear. You can endure it. Why? Because if you couldn't endure it, whatever it is that anybody could endure, you wouldn't be having it placed upon you. He's not saying because you are special, you're getting this extra difficult temptation. He's saying you can endure it. How can I endure it? He tells you in this verse, God is faithful. Whatever comes my way, I know going into it that I'm going to be able to endure it. Doesn't mean I will endure it. I could slip up and fall. But I can endure it if I rely on the ever-true faithfulness of God. God is faithful. And because God is faithful, I don't have to be overwhelmed by every trial that comes my way. I can have a way of escape. What's the way of escape? He tells me in the verse, the faithfulness of God. Therefore, I can bear those trials that come my way. I don't have to flee to idolatry. Rather, I should flee from idolatry. Verse 14. I speak as to wise men. Wise men, judge you what I say. You brethren, some of you think you're so smart, he says. Well, then you ought to know that I'm being straight with you. The cup of blessing which we bless. He's using the Lord's Supper to make his point. Is it not communion with the blood of Christ? The bread which we break, is it not communion with the body of Christ? When you worship and take the Lord's Supper, specifically, you are communing. You are having a relationship. You are having a conversation in a spiritual sense with Jesus Christ, His blood, His body. For we being many, verse 17, are one bread and one body, for we are all partakers of that one bread. We all partake of the one bread, maybe broken in pieces, or we break it ourselves, that's irrelevant. We all partake of the one bread because it symbolizes the one body of Christ, of which we are all spiritually partakers if we're part of His church. And then he says, verse 18, behold Israel after the flesh. Behold physical Israel as an illustration. Are not they which eat of the sacrifices partakers of the altar? Whomever you commune with in worship is your God, just as the priest who would offer the sacrifice and then would eat of that meat are in effect communing with God to whom they had offered the sacrifice. Verse 19, what say I then? That an idol is anything, or that which is offered in sacrifice to idols is anything? Your mindset has to be right. Remember what you're doing when you eat these various things that you're eating. Verse 20, but I say that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to devils, and not to God, to false gods, and not to the true God. And I would not that you should have fellowship with devils. Stop fellowshipping with idol-worshipping Gentiles. You former idol-worshipping Gentiles. Stop fellowshipping with those who were once like you. These pagans. You can buy their meat. You can take it home and you can eat their meat. But don't worship as they worship. Don't eat the meat as worship. This is a wonderful companion to the study of chapter 8, where he described eating meat offered to an idol. And his point there was, it's okay to eat meat offered to an idol because an idol doesn't exist. Well, the presumption behind that chapter is that you're eating it just as meat. And there's nothing inherently idolatrous about it. But you can make it idolatrous. And that's what he's talking about in chapter 10. If I eat it as communion, well, then I am an idolater, because I'm eating it like the pagans of the of my old life do. And then he continues, verse 21, you cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of devils. He had already made his point about the meat, eating the bread. Now he turns to the fruit of the vine and makes the connection to paganism and idolatry. You can't drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of devils. You cannot be partakers of the Lord's table and the table of devils. If you worship with pagans, you are a pagan. That is, if you worship with pagan religion, then you become a pagan and you commune with their false god. Even though he doesn't exist, that false god, you become an idolater nonetheless. Verse 20, do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? A hearkening back to the first commandment of the 10 commandments. Have no other gods before me. Why? Because God is a jealous God. Now, we're not under the 10 commandments, but that characteristic of God is universal. God is a jealous God. I have no right to be jealous of anyone because I am equal with all men. I can't be jealous of another man because we're equal. But God can be jealous of me because God is superior. And for me to turn to something other than God is to try to make something inferior superior to the supreme being. Thus he has every right to be jealous because he is greater than those things. So we should not provoke the Lord to jealousy. We're not stronger than him. We are less than him. He is greater than us. Verse 23. All things are lawful unto me, but all things are not expedient. All things are lawful for me, but all things do not always edify, or all things edify not. I may be allowed a thing in and of itself. For example, in this case, to eat dinner with a non-Christian, to enjoy a meal with my pagan friend or pagan relative. But if in doing so, he takes the position, or I take the position that we are worshiping the God that he had sacrificed the meat to, well, then I commune with devils and not with God. Verse 24, let no man seek his own, but every man another's. Unfortunately, my Bible adds the word wealth at the end of verse 24. But wealth is not in the original language. Otherwise, he's saying we need to go out like Robin Hood and steal other men's riches. What he says is, let every man seek his own, not seek his own, but rather every man another's. I should be seeking others first and not putting myself first, is what he's saying here. Stop putting yourself first. Stop thinking only of yourself. Think of others around you. Whatever is sold, verse 25, in the shambles, the meat market, that eat, asking no question for conscience sake. There were in those days, you'd go to the town square, you'd go to the market where you would buy your food or what have you, and it would be almost a semicircle of these various shops and markets, behind which would be the temples or the altars where those sellers of the meat would offer their animals in sacrifice to their false gods, and then they would turn around at the booth in front of the store where you would purchase it in the shopping center, and you would buy that meat, those shambles, those meat markets. And he says if that meat is placed in front of you, eat it, but don't ask where it came from, because if you ask, did this meat come from an idol, and the pagan who sold it to you or placed the meat in front of you says yes, then he thinks if you eat it, then you're worshiping his idol. And the point he's making, that he's been making for the past several verses, is if that's what he thinks, that's what you're doing. If you leave him with the impression that you're eating his meat offered to an idol as worship, then you're eating it as worship. You may not have intended it, but stop thinking of just yourself, as he said in verse 24. Consider what another might think. And so don't ask, just eat, asking no questions for his conscience sake, as he'll say in just a moment. Verse 26, for the earth is the Lord and the fullness thereof. That's a Jewish expression. It was commonly used as a prayer before their meal. They would bow their heads and say, the earth is the Lord and the fullness, whatever meat they're eating, belongs to him. So in other words, when you would set the meat down in front of you, instead of asking did it come from a false god, just offer a prayer for it to the true God. 27. If any of them that believe not bid you to a feast, if any of these non-Christian pagans invite you to a feast, and you be disposed to go, whatever is set before you, eat, asking no question for conscience sake. He's basically restating what he said in verse 25. He's just elaborating to make sure that we understand. He's talking about if a pagan places meat in front of me, then I should eat it, asking not where it came from, not for my conscience sake, but for his conscience sake. Notice again verse 28. But if any man say unto you, this was offered in sacrifice to idols, in that case he says, don't eat, for his sake that showed it, and for conscience sake, for the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. If he doesn't say where it came from, don't ask, because if he says it came from an idol, then what do? Then I look like a bad guest when I'm unable to eat it. If he says it didn't come from an idol, it's no big deal either way. But he says, his point is, don't ask where it came from. If, however, he places the meat in front of you, and he makes sure to tell you that he offered it to his false god, then he's basically setting you up to partake of it as worship, as an offering to that god. Instead, he says, you don't eat it. Why? Because the earth is the Lord's and not his false gods. And the fullness, including that meat, it belongs to him and not to that false god. And so you eat it not for conscience. Whose conscience? Verse 29. Conscience, I say, not for your own, but for the other. For why is my liberty judged of another man's conscience? Don't be guided by what someone thinks, but what they say, or what they say or do. Don't be led by their wishes. Don't let them lead you around. In other words, so conscience not for your sake, but for theirs that you're worrying about. My liberty is not judged of another man's conscience. I'm free in Christ to eat the meat whether I want to or whether they care if I do or not. I'm free to eat the meat. But if your conscience comes into play, in the case of this pagan, if he thinks I'm doing it as an idolatrous practice, then I have to be considerate of his conscience and not eat it. Not that he would be offended, but the opposite, that he would assume I was being an idolater, and I wouldn't want him thinking that. Verse 30. For if I by grace be a partaker, why am I evil spoken of for that which I give thanks? In other words, as he said at the end of verse 28, he repeats that prayer, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. So, for if I by grace be a partaker, if I eat it just to eat it, why am I evil spoken of for that which I give thanks? Don't judge me because you're offended by it. Don't judge because you offered it to a god and I chose not to eat it. Or don't assume that I'm an idolater just because I eat meat, period, that perhaps I bought from your meat market. He makes the point in the earlier verse to say, if you're explicitly told, then don't eat it. Otherwise, he says, by all means eat it. He in fact says, eat, asking nothing for conscience sake. And so if I am free to eat it, I have no right, you have no right to speak evil of me for doing so. Whatsoever therefore you eat or drink, whatever you do, do it to the glory of God, and not concerning these pagans. Make sure you put God first in all things, and everything else will fall in place. Verse 32, give none offense, neither to the Jews, nor to the Gentiles, nor to the church of God. If it's your opinion that you should or shouldn't, keep your opinions to yourself, a point he made already in this study. Even as I please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, that they may be saved. I'll do what I have to do to save a soul. If that means eat it, I'll eat. Unless it's implicitly or explicitly stated that this is now an idolatrous practice. I'll eat it if I can, unless I absolutely can't, then I won't. But either I'll eat or not eat, he says in general, if it will help me save a soul. Again, as he says, even as I please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many. I'm always looking, he says, for how I might help another and not myself, so that they may be saved. It's a little bit convoluted. Sometimes it sounds a little contradictory or maybe even just confusing. But I think his overall point in this second of two problems in this chapter, this one concerning idolatry, to just kind of summarize, is if you buy the meat, or if the meat is set in front of you, and he doesn't say where it came from, Paul says, eat it, asking no questions for his conscience sake. If he explicitly says it came from an idolatrous altar, and therefore your eating it is communing with me, and that's why he made the point to the Lord's Supper, then if you eat it then, you're communing with devils and not with God. you're eating a meat as though it were an idolatrous practice, and that would be wrong. So I don't see any contradiction with 1 Corinthians 8. I see it as a companion to 1 Corinthians 8. Whereas chapter 8 is dealing with situation between brethren. This brethren sees this other brother eating meat offered to an idol, and so he thinks he's an idolater. Paul's point in that chapter was meat is just meat. Where it came from is irrelevant. It just came on fire pit. Whether it was an altar to somebody else or not, it's irrelevant. Here in chapter 10, he's dealing with me and a non-Christian, me and a pagan, me and an idolater who perhaps even cooked the meat as an idolatrous worship practice. And so he makes sure to basically cover all of his bases there. But his general point is, go ahead and eat the meat, unless you're explicitly told that it is idolatrous, because you're trying to save souls and not worry about your own conscience in all things. And that is chapter 10. As we open chapter 11, there are two problems in that chapter as well that Paul will deal with, which we will cover the next time we study the book of 1 Corinthians. Until then, thank you so much.